People always ask me, they'll say, why'd you change your name? I said, well, save Micro and Amplifon to save Tennessee. Steve's still asking that.
That's a great question. We get the name all the time, and no, we are not a Vegas-based organization.
It has some proprietary software that can help map the entire land area that we're looking at to basically look and see where the issues may be quicker, faster, and safer.
This is the Oil and Gas Contractors Connect podcast with your host, Ryan Ray.
Welcome to another edition of the Oil and Gas Contractors Connect podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Ray, as always. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is the show where you get to connect with folks from upstream, midstream, downstream, all over the oil and gas industry, right here on this podcast. If you or someone that you know would like to be on this show, the best way to reach me is via LinkedIn. We'll link to my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. And as always, this show is brought to you by R Squared Global. For more information about R Squared Global, go to GoR2.com. That's GOR, the number 2.com. Today we have on Karr Ingham, who is a consulting petroleum economist for the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. Karr, that is a mouthful. Did I get it right?
You got it absolutely right. Well done.
All right. Well, good deal. We got through the hard part. First off, so let's take this in two parts. What is a consulting petroleum economist first? And then the follow-up to that is who is the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers?
Sure. Well, a consulting petroleum economist is, number one, a petroleum economist. And number two, in my case, I serve as a consultant to this group. So I, in fact, am a contractor to the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. So vocationally, I'm an economist with two areas of specialty or expertise or work or whatever you want to call it. I'm a regional metro guy. So I put these tracking devices in place for tracking the general cyclical movements and the general health of regional and metro economies around Texas. And so I do that for banks and economic development corporations and media groups and so on and so forth, people that have a stake in the metro level economy in which they have operations. I learned early on, so I've been at this about 20 something years now. I first got paid to do anything as an economist in January of 1996. So that's when it counts, when somebody will pay you to do something. So 2019, so we're looking at 23-ish years now with me as an economist. One of the early places I began doing this regional metro work was in the Midland, Odessa, what was then a combined metro area in Texas. Now it's split off as two metro areas. That didn't mean those two cities got any further apart. And it's still what we would call the Petroplex, because that's what that is out there in oil and gas economy. So I figured out you can't really be a general economist out there without sort of turning yourself into an oil and gas guy. So I put together a tracking index for the upstream, the exploration production end of the regional economy out there. And then about 2002 or 3, the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers brought me on board to create a statewide oil and gas activity index called the Texas Petro Index. We actually took that thing back to 1995 for its origin, its starting point, and we've just been calculating that thing every month since then. But of course, I do other work for the Alliance, for that Oil and Gas Trade Association as their, as their oil and gas economist. And so that's what a petroleum economist is. I mean, there are all sorts of areas of economic expertise and activity, all kinds of economists out there doing different kinds of work. So you got the national guys, and they may work for the government. They may work for the Fed. They may work for huge national or multinational corporations. They may work for large economic analysis firms doing national macro, which is to say big picture economic forecasting and analysis and so on and so forth. And then you've got a regional or metro guy like me. You've got real estate guys. You've got oil and gas guys. You've got other industries. So, again, all sorts of economists out there doing all sorts of things. And I just happen to specialize in those two areas, and an increasing amount of time over the years spent on the oil and gas work just because of the nature of what's happened in the great state of Texas.
One of the questions I have about this economist in general and tracking numbers and making projections and things like that is you'll see these reports that come out. And on the Texas Oil and Gas podcast, I can't remember, I think it's maybe the Dallas Fed, I can't remember who it is. They put out these numbers, and they'll measure job growth. or unemployment for the oil and gas industry. And if you look at the metrics that they're using, I always am kind of critical of them because while I'm sympathetic to the case that hey that they can't measure everything, I'm also kind of critical that we need to be reminded that this can't actually be representative of everything because the company that I own, R Square Global, would not be measured in this study, and yet we are 100% dedicated to oil and gas stuff. And so if the oil and gas market's doing good, all right, we're doing good. If it's doing bad, we're doing bad. But because we don't fit into some kind of governmental code, we don't fall in the survey view. From an economist standpoint, can you kind of walk us through how hard it is to, and this is the sympathy part of it, how hard it is to make determinations on when you cut off your data, who is included in your data, and kind of how do you collect it, and how do you make sure it's I don't know if fair and balanced is the right term, but it's a proper representation of what you're trying to study.
Oh, what a great question that is. So first of all, it kind of depends on what you're after. What is the piece of information that you're trying to come up with? What is it you are actually trying to analyze and then convey to a broader audience about what that means? So once you know that, you can set about defining a data set or a group of components, a series of data sets that will do that for you analytically. And so if your purpose, and the Texas Petro Index is a perfect example of this. So the components of that thing, and they have the same limitations you were just discussing, are the price paid to producers for crude oil and natural gas, the statewide rig count, number of drilling permits issued, oil and gas well completions in Texas, the sheer volume of production of both crude oil and natural gas, the value of that production, and then oil and gas industry employment. But in that case, we're talking about direct industry employment, people who are on the payrolls of companies that either produce crude oil and natural gas and operate wells and fields and leases, or they are on the payrolls of oil and gas drilling companies or service companies. So that defines, to me, direct upstream oil and gas employment in Texas. What it does not define is you or me, by the way,
Right.
or people that supply goods and services to those group of companies. And so, again, it depends on what you're trying to define. I'm trying to define the cyclical health, the movement over time, the turning points in all of this, of the Texas, what I would call the Texas upstream oil and gas economy. Those guys at the Dallas Fed, I know them. I'm familiar with the metrics that they have in place, some of the things, some of the tools that they've put together. And listen, I mean, these are Dallas Fed economists. They're PhDs for the most part. They're as good as it gets. I mean, they've got the analytical resources of the Fed behind them, whereas even somebody like me, doesn't really have that. So if your task is simply to for example, track the movement and the direct condition of the Texas upstream oil and gas economy, well, you can accomplish it through what I'm doing and through what they're doing. If your task is something beyond that, and listen, it often is. I spend a great lot of my time talking about the connection between the oil and gas industry directly and the statewide economy in Texas or regional economies around Texas. And this is where your question really comes into play. So economists have these group of tools at their disposal, and one of these is this highly utilized, often misutilized thing called the multiplier effect, or economic multipliers. In other words, an industry that has a direct contribution of this to the economy, when you sort of spin that out to the broader economy, here's what that looks in terms of ancillary employment and ancillary economic impact, things that are related to the direct activity of the industry, but are not captured in that first set of numbers. And so when I say misutilized, you know as well as I do, you've seen all manner of economic impact studies that just appear to be perfectly overcooked and kind of designed to meet the needs of whoever paid for that economic impact study. And so I try to be much more careful about that. And so, for example, if I were going to try to come up with a number that you just talked about, the government, the federal government, the Bureau of Economic Analysis actually puts out a set of multipliers for the state of Texas, or for one county in Texas for that matter. And so you can sort of take or leave these numbers, but they're actually pretty well done. And some larger economic impact models like M-Plan, which is kind of a famous input-output economic impact model uses these Bureau of Economic Analysis multipliers. And so what they will do is they will say, okay, there are X number of direct upstream jobs, which is these operating and producing, drilling, or service company jobs in Texas. Beyond that, though, I mean, whether you agree with the multiplier or not, or whether you think the study that you just read was using these overcooked multipliers, there's no doubt about the fact that these multipliers do exist. And here's how you think about that. The industry itself does this direct work, and it generates these direct dollars, and it pays these people on their direct payrolls. But the industry then purchases all manner of goods and services from a next tier group of companies. This will be oil field pumping equipment. It'll be pipe. It'll be paper, you name it. They are directly purchasing goods and services from a second tier of suppliers. And then beyond that, there are just all manner of other jobs that are connected to that industry that grow bigger and get better when the industry grows and gets bigger and better. And your job and my job would fall into those two categories. So think about this in terms of the direct effect, the indirect effect, which is that next group of companies, that second tier, which are directly in the supply chain. And maybe that is you and me as well. Mm-hmm. And then what economists call induced impacts, which is, the broader impact of the economy out there, which is to say restaurants and automobile dealers and home builders and all of these things. When the economy gets bigger and better because the oil and gas industry got bigger and better, the pie gets bigger, and things that are seemingly unconnected to oil and gas, their business is better simply because the oil and gas business is doing well.
That's kind of the thing we'll always say is they're not measuring how many more 18-wheeler truck tires are being produced, because the truck, as we know here in Texas, at least, the amount of 18-wheelers is skyrocketed through oil and gas use. And I don't know, so I'm agree with everything you're saying. I don't know how you'd measure that and how you put it in there, but those are the kind of things that we'd point out. So which leads me, I think we fundamentally agree that that you can measure certain things, and there's other things you can't measure. Maybe then my question, let's rephrase it, is do you feel like, as an economist, that when you put out studies or you see your results put out into the media, that maybe the media doesn't actually interpret the purpose of the study, and then they report it, and then someone like myself reads it and goes, okay, this economist over here or that economist over there is saying this, but then we kind of have problems because we're like, well, I'm not really sure if they're measuring that right. And maybe there's a disconnect between the economists and the media themselves.
Well, I think that's exactly what happens. And by the way, I place as much blame on us as I do them. The Dallas Fed guys, for example, they put out a quarterly piece of work that is kind of a survey of oil and gas people in the upstream oil and gas business out there. In other words, players in the upstream oil and gas industry in Texas. And so they will complete this survey and they'll put out the results of this survey, and they really don't talk much beyond that. And so if you're not familiar with what this thing is doing or what they are suggesting that the broader impacts of this are, I mean, you just kind of read this thing and it kind of rolls off of you as, well, that was a little bit useful information, but I don't really understand what the broader impacts of that are. Well, the Petro Index is sort of the same way. And so there are all manner of ways to link this to actual data at the statewide or regional level. Unfortunately, that doesn't always get down to the level of data that you might want, just because, and listen, thank goodness for this, by the way. I mean, there's not some government poobah out there collecting information on everything that's actually sold.
Right.
Not yet. But, there's not yet, exactly. But there is more data out there than you probably realize about industry level employment. I mean, you can really segregate this down to the county level by the government industry code, the North American Industrial Classification System. So if you really want to, I mean, you can really drill down to this stuff. Depending on, again, what it is you're looking for, what kind of information you're trying to put out. I think in our case, we want people to know whether the business is going up or down. Are we in a period of expansion or contraction in the statewide oil and gas economy? What is the rate of expansion or contraction? And what does this look like next to the broader economy in terms of general retail sales statewide, in terms of employment statewide, in terms of other things that imply general economic growth or the addition of economic wealth to the economy, all of the things that the oil and gas business does for the state of Texas. And so, yes, I think economists kind of do a poor job of making the bigger picture. In other words, yes, you did this piece of work, and here's the number. What does that mean? I mean, what are the implications of this? And so I think we need to do a better job in our profession of kind of moving this beyond the numbers and talking about the broader implication. Then I do believe that there's just sort of a general lack of understanding in the media out there, but my goodness, I don't know how you can put that off on them. I mean, as well as I do, I've had enough exposure to the media guys to know that even the brightest of those simply cannot be experts in everything.
Right.
And so it's our job to make the case, I think, and we try to do that with the Petro Index and other things that we do in terms of the public education component of my work with that association. But there's probably always going to be some element of that.
Yeah, and just the final thing on this, kind of move on to more of a little bit to shift the topic here. But the final thing I'd say about oil and gas in general is, so the Texas Oil and Gas podcast, we have certain things we talk about. On Energy Week with Ellen, we shift the focus, but also the way that Ellen views the oil and gas world and whether the industry's up or down is fundamentally different than how I view it. Because I, as someone who has a company who's servicing oil and gas companies, I'm trying to make sure that the price is in a spot that they're actually going to go do work. Where she kind of views it more, she's not a trader, but she kind of views it more from, is the market up, 60 cents today or 3% today or whatever. For me, that's kind of not necessarily as important. And so I imagine as an economist, that's also hard, is, trying to make sure that the data that the study is actually relevant to the right segment of the industry, because certain segments of the industry look at the price differently than others.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, from my standpoint, daily movements in crude oil prices, unless it's a big number, that doesn't really mean that much to me. It does matter to me whether the price of crude oil is $20 higher today than it was a year ago at this time.
Right.
And it matters to me about our expectations is where it's going to be 6 months from now, because it's going to drive certain things. And if you have an expectation that crude oil prices will generally be at some higher level in the future, well, that tells us an awful lot about what's getting ready to happen in 2019 to the statewide oil and gas economy, for example. So there are all different ways of looking at this. You can look at daily movement of prices or weekly or even monthly, whatever the case may be, for crude oil and natural gas on the futures market. You can look at stock prices, which, my goodness, people just seem to focus incessantly on that.
Right.
There are all manner of other things that tell us information about the general condition of the Texas oil and gas economy beyond that. And in fact, there's really no stock component, although it's not a terrible idea, of the Texas Petro Index. So we do focus on the price that is actually paid to producers, called the posted price, not the futures price. Mm-hmm. But even the rig count, just consider that. I mean, 20 years ago, the rig count meant something much different than it means right now. That's right. One rig meant one hole drilled in the ground and one well completed. Mm-hmm. Well, my goodness, that situation has changed. And the technology at work there is just fantastic, which I don't think people have a great understanding of. Now, one rig parked in one location may mean 10 wells completed from that same pad, drilled and completed from right there. But in my data, that should show up in other areas like drilling permits taken for one well, which there can be 10 of those associated with one rig, or the number of wells completed, and of course the sheer volume of production itself. So that should be captured somewhere else in my data. But again, I think we need to understand the implications of how these things are changing over time.
Okay, so let's shift now, because stuff like this fascinates me, but anytime I actually look at economics, I realize I'm quickly out of my league because of the math and what's going on here. But it's very interesting stuff. So for listeners who might go, okay, this is very interesting.
Just one final word about that, though. Math, particularly economics, particularly at the academic level and particularly the upper level masters and PhDs has increasingly turned into something, economists call econometrics, which is math and statistics. And there's for people who philosophically believe, as I do, about the study and nature of economics. Economists ought to think like economists and not simply as statisticians. And so we're often increasingly critical of the academic economics profession as being something that just simply focuses on statistics and numbers and high math and formulas and things that people can't read, and never talk about basic economics and what the philosophical implications of what we're doing are and that sort of thing. And so, number one, try not to make that mistake. And number two, I just kind of like to be the layman's economist, where I hope I can explain whatever it is I'm doing in a way that makes sense to people and that they can understand about what that means and how that, what implications that may have toward their life and work and so on and so forth.
Okay, so with that in mind, if someone said, you know what, this is fascinating, I really want to do this, I want to pursue a career as an economist, what are kind of the steps? Because when you think of an economist, you think of someone, sitting on Fox News or MSNBC or wherever, Bloomberg, and talking, kind of ivory tower stuff. And as you mentioned, the Dallas Fed guys got PhDs upon PhDs. So listener out there goes, wow, this is all fascinating. I could actually get out there and do some practical measurements and understand what's going on in the world. College degree, master's level degree. What's kind of the path for someone who might want to be an economist? What would you recommend?
Well, if you want to be an economist, sadly, first of all, you need to have the interest in it, and that interest needs to be sufficient to take you through at least a bachelor level economics program. I mean, if you don't have that, if you don't have a bachelor's degree in economics, it would be very hard, I think, for you to end up calling yourself that. It's not that it hasn't happened, but that may come from spending kind of years of work doing that and just kind of turning yourself into an economist over time. But of course, some of the greatest economists in all of our history were not really economists to start with. I mean, Adam Smith was more philosopher than economist, and yet he's kind of generally regarded as the father of modern economics just because he laid out a lot of these principles that are just almost gospel now to people like you and me, and people who generally believe in free markets and a properly functioning price system and all these things. So, but you've got to do a little schooling in economics these days. And then even at that, if you want to get a bachelor's degree in economics and then go work as an economist somewhere, well, that's kind of difficult. Although you may be able to find an entry-level analytics position or economic position at possibly the Fed, possibly in government somewhere, either at the state or national level, because there are economists at the Texas Workforce Commission, for example, or the comptroller's office, or at the national level in D.C. or whatever the case may be. There are some pretty good-sized economics and analysis firms. IHS comes to mind at the national level that do a lot of oil and gas work, and so they will hire some entry-level economists that have bachelor's degrees. It's much easier to kind of become an economist with at least a master's degree, and then a lot of them are PhDs. But again, a lot of PhDs out there that I listen to them and I think, good Lord, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. They don't sound like an economist to me. Right. They sound like they have a political agenda that is driving their economics rather than the other way around, which I just find despicable for the most part. And so, it's not that there's simply one path, but you really need to start with that. You need to go get a degree in economics. You need to be interested in it enough to go do that. Okay.
Well, that's good stuff. So bachelor's degree, you don't have to spend 47 years of your life doing it. And to be quite frank with you, as we're talking offline, we probably need a few more economists. And in today's market, I'm curious, some jobs that historically were kind of, I guess in the 50s, let's say, in the 40s, maybe being an economist was very hard. But maybe today, with the ability to self-publish, create your own content, podcast, you might be able to create a unique niche that wasn't there before for someone who is interested in stuff like this. But there's plenty of data out there to be measured and plenty of things to be tracked. I think we both would agree there's a lot of work that could be done if we had more people that had the time and energy and effort to do it.
There is, but you can call yourself an analyst or a statistician, and you can just go pull data and you can run some analyses on that data set. You can say things that make it sound like you are, some highbrow economics type. But if you can't tell me, what that means to you, if you can't tell me what your general economic philosophy is, I mean, it's hard for me to call a person an economist who can't move beyond those numbers. There's something out there that's generally referred to as the economic way of thinking, which means that yes, you can propose, let's say, a particular policy to address a particular issue. And what most people do at that point is they really only get to the first level and they say, here's what the outcome will be. And yes, that'll be a good thing. They never move beyond that to talk about what the spin out effects will be on down the line. That's what the economist needs to do. The economist also needs to know who he or she is. Are you a free markets guy? Are you a classic liberal guy? And classic liberal in economics does not mean liberal in political terms. It means more of a very fundamental free market approach. Or are you a government authoritarian type? There, again, all manner of economists out there, and they run the gamut on that. So I really want to know where a person is coming from, because increasingly that really informs whatever they may be putting out there on the economic side. And unfortunately, the fact that they can kind of throw this out there and sound like an economist, which is to say expert, is often a tool that is used to lead people down the path they want them to go.
Good stuff. Good points there. Okay, we are going to wrap it up with this. First off, as we said already, Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. If folks want to follow your work, follow what you're doing for them, or anywhere else, where might you want them to connect or follow you at?
Sure. The Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, again, is a statewide upstream or exploration production trade association in Texas. We're pretty good size. We've got about 2,600 members. Our general wheelhouse is independent producers in Texas, and generally a lot of the smaller independents that added up account for an awful lot of production, very important to the industry in Texas, although we have some of the larger publicly traded independents and some of the majors represented in our membership as well. And we really exist to advocate for that group. And my service to them as an economist often supports that work at the governmental relations level, either in Texas at the state level or nationally. And then our public education, just kind of, here's what the economy looks like. Here's what that means to Texas. So you can follow us at our website, the texasalliance.org. And, I should have a greater grip on our social media handles and such. But we've got a pretty strong presence there, and we've got people that manage that for us. We're pretty easy to find, though. The Texas Alliance of Energy Producers is our name. And again, our website is texasalliance.org. And we exist to serve the independent oil and gas producer in the state of Texas.
Okay, and we'll get those social media handles and put them in the show notes for the listeners. And so, Karr, it's been fantastic to get to chat with you, and really enjoyed the discussion. And anything we skipped or missed over before we get out of here today?
Well, I don't think so. What a pleasure this has been. I truly appreciate you having me on.
Okay, and thank you so much for your time. And to the listeners, until next time, keep climbing.